Hello everyone, today we talk about Eurasian nomadic tactics between the 6th and the 11th century. It's not the first video about steppes warfare. As you know, I have pretty hefty playlist dedicated to it. We made some mini-series even probably about the development of nomadic panoplies, let's say the general history of the Eurasian steppe in relation with of course, the sanitary world and its political, military, and cultural implications. We haven't finished that yet. In some sense, we have hardly ever begun. Today we focus, however, on tactics of these peoples. We could stick in many ways to Byzantine manuals. In part, we'll draw information from there. As for other peoples, we observed their tactics and we sort of adapted mostly to the strategicon, to the tactica that are basically just copying the first. But there are so many nomadic peoples, and even though they did fight in very similar ways, indeed we have sort of broader pool of sources to draw from. And the most important thing this video is to draw probably the essentials of the art of war of these populations. So to understand why they fought the way they did, right, and how, just of course, also they actually fought, which is maybe for the average layman like a substantial point of interest. And of course, the information is pretty eloquent there. You must sort of make sense of that, especially combined arms tactics, because most sources that are, of course, from the sanitary world, because that was the literate one, differently from the steppes, mostly highlight a bit like the face of this warfare, and mostly what struck the sanitary, like sort of heavier and less mobile armies. In fact, was speed, arrow fire, but actually the nomadic tactics were very, let's say, complex in their arms synergy, right? And the most underrated aspect of these nomadic hosts was actually their heavily armored component. That surely was small, was not sufficient compared to the heavier sedentary armies to, in fact, deliver that smashing blow like that the cavalry charge is designed for in the first place. We've seen it in different battles, including massacres, etc. In some ways, Asiatic tactics are a bit overrated. The sense that that there is this psychological warfare that is terrifying, remaining under a hail of arrows for an entire day, not knowing where, in fact, the heavy the proper attack is gonna come, because the horse archers, the missile troops in general, being light, are not meant to do so. That they have mostly preparatory function. You don't defeat armies with the missile element. Is sort of like, I wouldn't say the Western nightmare, because there are so many examples also in recent history of successful counter-insurgency, counter-guerrilla warfare, like this idea of the in brackets conventional forces always having trouble against resistance. That's not a military problem, right? There are this is, and even more, like if you behave strategically, like again avoiding direct confrontation in open fields, you're strategically inferior. There's nothing to do about that, right? People confuse this with some ever-winning strategy because they don't even visualize that, of course, warfare is an instrument of politics. So it's not much a way of war. This is not even a way of war. Like any other army would behave in the same way were they in that particular situation. There's no Orientalism in here, some sort of deeper military philosophy behind it. Humans fight pretty much in the same ways, and the way they differ, of course, are how this is declined on the basis of their politics and their society, right? So it's not that those are not important, of course they are, but conceptually, strictly speaking, they're not military by definition. They are interdependent with one another, they mirror one another, but they don't speak for the military logic of any engagement that always modulates on the basis of what the situation is, with the laws of reciprocity, with the enemy, and more. So I made this point very often because I think those who have been following me for a long time know that I think I'm actually pretty objective. At least that's the first thing I strive for, because my military historical analysis is founded on this principle. I know that I must make sense of this logically and rationally, because these things happen for real, right? They're not history is not an alternative to fiction that you can just mold the way you like. These things happen in reality. We have after all, a pretty large amount of evidence, so you must make sense of something that happened for real. It's not the fruit of your imagination. And so even though we don't know precisely what happened for real, just to reconstruct the world system, because we don't even know what happened to us in the last day concretely, and there is no way to measure that scientifically, still approaching that level of objectivity that is, say, satisfactory for our standards is at least a must, right? And so there is a reason why steppes people fought the way they did. Today we don't look much at the social, political aspect of the story. We'll make another video about this nomadic armies organization, which is another thing. It touches on a series of different problems, in fact, organizational, political, logistical. Today, of course, these things partly intertwine. We'll see them. But today we essentially look at how these armies overall fought, right? Because there is not this radical difference, right? We've seen it also in the videos I made for the military historical unit series about the heavy nomadic, I think I titled it Asiatic or something, horsemen, and the light one, right? And we have already illustrated there how it doesn't even make much sense to try to distinguish these troops, especially the lighter ones that were, by the way, the overwhelming majority numerically in these armies, even across this half of a millennium, because they were all pretty much the same, right? And then, of course, yes, for the sake of what we know specifically about this or that people, we can say, okay, this people is said by this author to have fought with this type of weapon shaped in that way or made, and we talk generally about the equipment, etc. But as I was saying before, this falls all into a broader pattern of functionality that pretty much all these peoples shared, and it actually helps reconstructing pretty much all of them, right, military-wise, without too much of a problem. So we can start from some points regarding these nomadic tactics, illustrating their primary principles, and a bit also looking at with that sanitary perspective, because they are the historians, the sources that, after all, give us this the information. So it's important to listen to them. Every source is biased, but contrary to what most people believe, bias is not necessarily negative or untrue, right? It's something that simply stresses more the accent on something rather than another, but it still entails a lot of things about the war. From one side, we have the effective deployment of horse archery, right? So the majority of these people's armies were composed, as we were saying, by missile, right? Their nomadic lifestyle had brought them to live largely a mounted lifestyle, also in a non-military sense. There is no difference between military and civilian, not even much at this point in the sanitary societies, just imagine among the nomadic ones. And the nomadic peoples are very, nomadic societies are very unbalanced compared to the sanitary ones, paradoxically, right? In the sanitary ones, you can find more certification, but there tends to be a heavier bulk of subjects that essentially live much better than, of course, what the average nomad does, even when they are they are framed, at least within a state that rules them more effectively, but because they accept to be ruled, and that's the same point. In the steppes, life is incredibly tougher than that. There are way less resources, much less surplus. As a consequence, you have basically, and this is true also for some semi-nomadic contexts, and mostly the tribal ones that really do not manage to achieve statehood and therefore enough political stability. That is, essentially, if you want to survive in the first place and to, like, just even for the sake of temporary resources consumption, literally to feed your people, you must essentially raid them, you must gamble into warfare with your neighbors, and as a consequence, you're essentially a militarized people that, not having, by the way, the better statal structures, basically has to accept not just this nomadism and like the need even just of moving, sometimes very far away, in order to get the necessary resources into some other people's land. But that is also incredibly fluid politically, in that basically witnesses the few surplus materializing into the hegemonic tribe that has basically subjected the others, that are despoiled because they have essentially to pay tributes, and or they have already been essentially reduced in some sort of subjection, and therefore spoliation of resources, and that will fight, in fact, at large, as this subject tribes, as lighter forces, right, that cannot afford essentially an armored at least bulk, right, and that can just attack at a distance, and therefore not being able to close in, if not against an equally equipped foe, which means a lot, because these are sort of individually incredibly skilled people, right? Never make the foolish mistake of considering yourself a more intelligent or capable person than a 7th century Bulgar horseman. But of course they must be, because they have to rely on themselves. There's not really like a broader, say, fixer like a government administration, some sounder amount of resources that a community can basically put in common to stabilize further. This is the reason why, like in the history of the world, eventually the nomadic world faded away, right? Was crushed under the heels of, especially during the Renaissance, like at that point, like without too much capacity of competition. But if you look at it in historical perspective, yes, you have waves of nomads that at some point managed to knock out the elite of a particular, even particularly powerful regional reality and installing themselves. But it's mostly just like a military elite that eventually melts, we would say, essentially blends with the overwhelming majority of the local population, and the entire system always remains what it largely had always been, right? And nomads have always remained out there in the steppes with those lower living standards, whereas civilizations have sort of gone on more effectively and have always had the upper end, after all. And this is something you can measure literally in the same geography of it. Like the steppes have a very precise boundary there, and that's in fact the boundary of civilization and sort of barbarity in the neutral sense. If you don't get offended for words, hopefully, we're not really on the channel where people do. So this proportion of horse archery may be impressive. It would have been also a very scenographic thing to watch. Like, it would have been incredibly annoying, but especially for sedentary forces. They wouldn't have just to sit there and take hits, like with better armor and protection, and again, generally in an effective way. This system, of course, was designed in part to cope with the sentries, but of course the primary enemy that they would have had to cope with them was themselves. This is true practically for every military culture. And so how the horse archers fought against one another mostly was just mass, right? Say fire concentration. That's also why they didn't need armor, aside from the fact that they didn't have it. Your best protection was speed, right? And at an individual level and at a collective one, mass, right? Because your best shield was outshooting the enemy, and if you succeeded in doing so because you were a more cohesive formation, so a more politically compact people, you would have the upper hand on the enemy. And of course, warfare is always about that collective dimension first, all right? Another characteristic of the nomadic art of war were ambushes, right? It could be carried out both tactically and strategically. The idea again was to lure the enemy, and especially the sanitary ones, right? The heavier foes into again giving way, because they and this is the point. Many people use the term feign flight, implying that, of course, there were these, especially the nomads, were into nocturnal feints. I mean, drawing you into the direst situation on purpose. But what we often forget in strictly strategical terms is that if you need to do that, right, you're already not in a good position. I mean, strategically, the first thing someone who has an advantage is to smash frontally, to concentrate, to deliver the best. Of course, you can use some tricks. You always should try to outflank the enemy. It's really a myth that the sanitary ward learned feign flights, flank attacks, and all this stuff from the steppes or from lighter peoples. This is a trope, for example, was repeated over and over again for the Crusades, but I don't think, having studied for some time medieval warfare, there is no evidence whatsoever that these tricks were in the stratagems were implemented just because of the contact with this sort of external cultures that actually had always been in contact with one another without any separation, especially in a sanitary context, like essentially the Crusades were, aside from the Central Asian origin of the Turks at their warfare. Because, of course, and I will not digress on this, except looking at here the type of sources: Arab, Persian, right? And this time, the sense is, of course, that regions like the Levant, the Middle East, Caucasus, and beyond were, even though sanitary, heavily influenced, because essentially of a less statal structure. At least we have some notable exception. The Abbasid Caliphate was a hell of a state with a permanent army, etc. But I mean, generally speaking, aside from the fact that, they were razed to the ground by the Mongols, and that is the actual point. Also, for the exception, the greater fragility in societal structures also due, for example, to Islam, that has a very sort of, as you know, that it doesn't have a priesthood. There is no check and balance for political power there, and so rendered everything dramatically less stable compared to the more slowly but more effectively also growing Latin Germanic world. Things way more, let's say, suitable for example, this Magyars, raiders from literally Central Asia that could arrive and in these places and loot and relatively unopposed. In part, this is true also for the Byzantine Empire that sclerotizes around Constantinople at the end of this period. Basically, that you have the largest elements of the Byzantine army actually constituted by these guys. Like if you list, there is a list of all the tens of thousands of steppes horsemen from different peoples that at the end of the day, as I said before, were actually all the same, siding the heavier Byzantine forces. You realize that these were sort of armies within armies. Of course, they politically, acted as those, like they were coalition forces. Most armies always are at the end of the day. Where do you draw the line? Therefore, there is a great reliability in this. Also because these steppe peoples tend to spring out of the steppe without stop. The Byzantines, also because of their geographical location, not only, also remember that geopolitics does not exist, knew better, right? Because they had learned that even if you made the effort to wipe an entire people out, there was always another one taking their place. So there was a better game into turning them against one another, other, for example, sedentary enemies of the empire. But as I was saying before, ambushing an enemy or giving way in the battle is, for these peoples, actually not much of an option. It's just like, even for the Mongols, that of course we made lots of videos about the Mongol art of war. You look at about a battle like Lenitsa, for example, where they said, the Mongols lured the Poles and the Germans into this feint flight. Was it a feint flight? Because in other words, did the Mongols have a center that could be spent against the Western heavy cavalry charge? The answer is no. Right, they would have at the end of the line, we've seen it also in the Ottoman armies that inherit much of this sort of steppe influence, that like the shock elite force that, as we've seen, is very narrow, right? It's very elite, right? They're very good actually. Like they have even better armor in some contexts than same Westerners individually, but they're also fewer, and so as a collective element, they don't really act as, they're not so performing, so they need to be properly at the very end of the deployment in depth, and to have created all these various layers of expendable forces that could of course also, like, they would flee, they would abandon their position during the battle, maybe to return, maybe to outflank, maybe to encircle, all this stuff, but still, right? And the point is that if the center actually is broken, like, these forces do not have the capacity to fight anyway, also because they are light, right? And lights can be useful also from a flank attack, because a flank attack is devastating no matter by whom it's carried out. These guys also have mobility from their side, so they're relatively more difficult to catch by the heavies. They don't commit the mistake also thinking that, say, a Western knight simply wouldn't chase just ever, like, lighter, I don't know, Seljuk horse archer, because they would, and we know that they did, just like, I don't know, a Spanish Reconquista knight would towards a Berber javeliner. Like, we've seen them over and over again, also in the past, like Iberian mercenaries against Numidian cavalry. The Spanish would chase the Numidians. Like, it's so the notion that, oh my god, it's a trap, you can't make out of it, it's better to bail out, it's completely false, right? If anything, the diametrically opposite is true. This is not to say that, of course, they would regularly chase them. Like, of course, the heavies have problems in chasing the lighter ones, especially the bigger the formation is. But the fact that somebody needs to abandon position to be chased is not a proof of military superiority at all, right? There is, in the sense of coordination from the side of the commanders, so because if you want to actually envelope the enemy with your wings and all this stuff, like, it takes a lot of of command capacity, etc. But again, had these guys had something punching or at least blocking to oppose to the enemy in the center, or to smash them, they would have used, because that's a universal principle, right? And that's also what they did against one another. They would have this antemne catching one another, and because the elite was so narrow, of course, they would still sort of send in between all these masses of horse archers, have to screen basically even the withdrawal during a defeat, right, of their leaders. But aside from this cavalry mobility, actually armies melt away all in the same way, and enemies get, let's say, the broken enemy gets captured anyway, because it's not much like whether you can ride a horse, but whether you're mentally destroyed by a defeat, right? And all what it meant religiously, politically, and socially, etc. You would have been dead anyway. And so this is the actual meaning, like, in this art of war. Another, say, important principle, as we've said, were feints, right? Ambushes would be carried out like flank attacks. We'll see now how some peoples living next to the steppes, of course, were more also inclined to use these tactics in similar ways. But also the flank attack is a universal principle. You find it in the heaviest of the military cultures. So although the nomads eschewed close combat, particularly when facing heavy cavalry, which always remember means cavalry is heavier than theirs to the point of not being able to hold ground against it, and there is a sharp division after all. There is a lot of in-betweens, yes, it is true, but let's say what is heavily armored is generally very, very, say, less common and therefore more identifiable than the average lighter rest. The nomadic forces were prepared to launch, however, a charge whenever circumstances allow. Right? There was a general all-in, full charge, exploiting the mass, right? Especially among each other. This was the actual deal. Of course, there was an attempt when, for example, a heavier enemy was withdrawing, keeping to harass him, but hardly. The Battle of Manzikert is beautiful in this. It shows that there's never like an open route. Like the Roman army actually withdraws in some not, say, excessively good order, because of course they had lost the battle in many ways, but they hadn't been broken, right? And so the battles would continue later on, would be about, okay, we shifted like an important, say, the odds, like in our favor important, but it's not like the enemy's completely melted away. You're simply a master of the battlefield. So very often, not even the heavies of the nomadic armies were able, after having shifted the odds in their favor, to actually break finally the heavier enemy in that case. But when fighting against one another, of course, light versus light is just like heavy versus heavy. It's the same thing. And so at that point, these lighter guys will charge against one another. And at that point, also that measure is relevant. And these, again, are the expendables that you can throw in that way. They wouldn't normally have like a close order. They were fighting practically in as missile troops, just in a open formation. But of course, they would be able to compact or recompact in different circumstances to ensure that like the critical mass could break through a softer enemy formation. The accuracy of the Turkic archers is attested by early Islamic sources, which credit them with the ability to cut down 1,000 horsemen with as many arrows, demonstrating their effectiveness in both attack and retreat. Here we're looking mostly at Arab sources. In the early Islamic invasions, the Turks had already been around from a while. They had been tormenting the Romans as the Sasanians, as you know. So the Arabs, by taking over the Middle East and therefore also closing the normal routes of access of the steppes war bands to the further west in the Levant, like North Africa, they would be and also reaching Central Asia practically. They would be the most directly acquainted with the Turks. We didn't talk too much about early medieval Turkic warfare, but this is sort of part of it. You know, the early Arab armies were basically about infantry. Like, they immediately began to use cavalry, but they were very sedentary in nature. I mean, they had started as semi-nomads in Arabia, but that was not a kind of nomadism that allowed, like, just for the same level of, say, hit-and-run tactics that the steppes peoples were habituated to. The Arabs were heavier, were tougher. They had now basically absorbed, like, the Roman and the Persian, say, resources, like, of the Levant. And so they were fighting as the civilizational force in front of these barbarians. And as you know, the Turkic gulams, so sort of slave soldiers, the term Mamluk, aside from the etymology, is basically equivalent in this military context, happens quite early, right? The Turkic mercenaries will eventually take over the Arab world, right? The same caliphate, but it will take centuries, and during which the Arabs would document like this earliest, like also more incredibly primitive and brutal Turkic reality that, as you know, had remained historically bottled into the far northeast of the steppes that had been widely dominated until China by the Indo-Europeans for millennia. That sprang out like of the exhaustion of the ancient world, that after all also the steppes were participating into. The Indo-European steppes had sort of, this would happen to the Turks too, as we will see now, gradually soften up a little bit, and that's also sort of began to gentrify, to centralize even in certain contexts, and therefore the Turks in this moment of exhaustion take over everything. And not much because they're this actually overwhelming force in a more compact way than before. It's just that civilization and all the surroundings have collapsed, and so these guys that have remained like in the fringe, like underdogs, basically spring out, and a bit like the Arabs do in the sanitary context, by the way. And this mechanism brings, like, the Turks were very underdeveloped in that sense, and that they would immediately, of course, their elites sort of modernize on the basis of the pre-exist, like a context with the Chinese, with the Indo-Europeans, but this broad frontier area that is something between the steppe and the sanitary world as well. And so very often we just know, like, we see the most civilized side of the story just because, of course, like the sources that are most likely to remain iconographically, archaeologically, come from places that are a bit more advanced, and they speak of the elite. But the average Turkic tribeman was really something, and really, really crude. But in this sense, under, like, in a civilized context, in the discipline of the Arab armies, and their state, right, that the Umayyads and the Abbasids had established fundamentally, they would do, like, next to the regulars, like these, they would become regulars themselves with actual ethnic regiment next to, say, some, I don't know, even Iranian forces, African ones, and so on. However, the most important component of those armies, and increasing a big deal, mounted warfare, right, that was, we'll see, like, how in the Islamic world this thing really worked, because in this early periods, infantry was, to an extent, they're very significant. The Arab society is not as feudal as other places in the sanitary world, but we'll talk about Islamic armies in some other context. The Arabs were impressed here by the multitude of the Turks, the fact that they, which was amplified by the psychological effect of sending waves of war bands that, again, were not even, they were meant to alternate one another in combat, just to spend their arrows and to, again, harass the enemy over and over again. So it would give you the impression that there was an endless host, but as a matter of fact, the steppes ones were also pretty similar, like to the sanitary ones, in, I don't know, maximum 30,000, something like this. And this arrow fire that was pretty heavy, and it's not like the Arabs had not been historically acquainted with horse archery. Like, think about the Persians dominating the Middle East, the Romans having also a hell of a missile power, different but still relevant way. So the Turks were really like the hardcore steppe, right? And so something relatively new in this landscape. The fact that they could attack both in attack and retreat. What does remember you? Of course, I'll remind you of the Parthian shot, right? Those tactics had been really, really the same, had remained, so the steppe made it, right? Their political and societal structure was no other way to fight, right? Moreover, the Arabs said the Turks could fire 10 arrows in the time it took, in this case a Karagate Arab, to fire one, showcasing their remarkable skill. So this would be done to, of course, to outshoot the enemy. Of course, the steppes peoples were, as we've seen, individually very, very effective, so that they would know everything about archery much better than the average Arab in the sanitary war. Doesn't matter whether he was a peasant, farmer, so someone who used the bow in, say, military and non-military context. A Turk knew much better how to do it, right? And say shooting 10 arrows instead of one, it may not generally, like, it has this, of course, crashing, overwhelming capacity. The point, of course, of missile fire is that the better, say, the more I can hit you with all my missile power at once, and the more I can exploit, like, the temporary amazement, right? I can shoot the same amount in the same amount of time, the same amount of projectiles, hitting in the same amount, so causing exactly the same physical damage. But if I do this in, say, instead of, then, I don't know, 1 minute, 10 seconds, I will amplify devastatingly, from a psychological point of view, the impact, and I will disorder much more directly and effectively your formation. And as a consequence, I will have some chance, as we'll see now, to close in and try to break you. Naturally, things were, say, here we're talking about one guy versus another guy. That is not warfare, right? And if it had been just about this shooting, of course, like, you know, this is a bit of an hyperbole of the 10 versus 1, but of course, the guy taking all these hits would have implemented mostly his defenses to cope with the guy. And in many ways, it was like that. And when especially larger units face one another, things become also much more complicated to deliver in the same way. In other words, even if one Turk would have outshot, like, the 10 to 1 an Arab archer in interest of time, well, this would have not been true for 100 Turks versus 100 Arabs. That divide would have dramatically shrunk the larger the number of the troops. If anything, for simple matters of this, of course, the collective aspect was to exploit, but it was carried out in much less sort of zone area shooting rather than, say, precisely shooting at a single guy, and this would have created also more dispersion, etc. And everything was still meant to get down to the final, say, charge of the heavy shock cavalry, which, interestingly enough, these sources do not stress too much, probably because these nomads were not so much habituated to waste again their elite in this attack. Also because they could simply go back in the steppes where they lived, and the sanitaries would rarely at least venture as far as that. The Arabs would chase the Arabs and from between the Caucasus, the Volga area, but there was no chance, like, for sanitary civilization either. Any useful need would all much richer regions around. Even the least appealing of the sanitary world, that were still better than the steppe, to in fact, like, stabilize the area, so to try to stop essentially what were just disturbing, say, raids, right? Not something that could definitely destabilize certain regions from the sanitary side, but that would have just remained destabilized, would have not really immediately witnessed the growth of an empire in a steppe that was stronger than a sanitary one. In fact, again, the objective of the nomads was to take over power into the sanitary places, to rule from those that were much more desirable than anything they had in the steppe. This was the ultimate purpose, and why these nomads pushed so much against the sanitary war. They wanted to live there, right? Except that would have, in any case, altered their own identity, because you cannot live like a steppe person in the center world. It doesn't make any sense, and especially it doesn't end well in at least unless you're already significantly civilized, you have some means to cope with that civilization. In other words, like the Mongols could install themselves dynastically in some areas, but it ended there. Like some of their armies would have been still settled in some sort of pastures in some more or less semi-desertic places, or semi-deserted to say the least. Attila could have never ruled over the Roman Empire. He didn't have the cultural tools to do that, right? It was impossible, all right? And again, don't overestimate steppe's power in general. There is also a bit of, I usually say it's a myth, right? I mostly criticize this when talking about the Mongols. It's the story that basically if the bowstrings get humidity, this will make the quality of your army collapse, right? The army of mostly of horse archers collapse, right? While it is true that there are actually multiple references to this, right? To the impact of rain weakening nomadic tactics, rendering bows allegedly useless, right? Both in the East and in the West, one does not understand why these people would expose themselves to something so banal, after all, as rain, right, humidity, to risk their lives in entire endeavors. Like, for example, damp bowstrings were cited as a reason for the Magyars' decisive defeat at Lechfeld in 955. So what is it that, you can't use archery just because at some point it rains, right? Or bows are not... We know, actually, that from many sources, actually, that there is all a precise way to keep bowstrings dry, because, of course, there is an effect of humidity on them. But, what about the Mongols fighting in Southeast Asia? That is not exactly a very dry place. Or, of course, they didn't have excessive fortune. At some point, like, they still succeeded, but without, say, permanent occupations or whatever. But what about conquering Russia in winter? That's not exactly a dry situation, right? So I think it's BS. Like, to be fully blunt about this, there is surely an impact that humidity has on bowstrings, but these people would know better the impact of this factor, and that would routinely go at war in contexts in which, of course, the weather could get humid and, of course, wouldn't stop them because it's not a major issue, right? The only thing I can imagine is that with a composite bow that, as you know, was offered a much more useful range than, say, the one we used, the simple ones we used in the West. Of course, in proportion to, in fact, the latter type of enemy, like, the performance would be reduced more. But from this to go on saying, these guys were defeated just because it rained, like, I don't think it's a pretty, especially at the strategic level, right? But even had it been something impacting the tactical performance, right, it sort of still doesn't make sense. At least nobody says straight out from the sources that say, like, literally, like, the reason why they lost decisively was that they had humid bowstrings. Like, that's not... we know, again, that there were preventive measures that surely speak for the fact that this was an issue, but again, this went both sides, and sources do not make the point that this was a 50% plus one of the reasons why these people lost, right? The fact just is that in battles, odds are, especially the most important one, are pretty balanced, and therefore, if you isolate the many factors that make those odds possible, and so, of course, that individually are just like as you mentioned, I don't know, a few points %. Maybe, yes, hadn't it rained, it would have been better. Like they would have passed from 48% to 50%. I mean, in fact, would have not even made it per se, because there was, in fact, another reason. Nobody computes, because how do you compute it, say, scientifically, or say, just quantitatively? It doesn't make any sense. But it's very far from being anything decisive per se, and again, it was an issue also for some sanitary armies, and we know that, in fact, it hardly had anything to do with how battles were won and lost. There were, so many other things that could go in a different way. For example, consider the logistical needs, right, of even producing all those arrows. If you consider the amount of arrows that could be carried on a battlefield, we calculated that a Mongol army, or even a Mamluk one for that matter, could carry something like up to, or surpassing even a million. And maybe shooting them all in, or something around that scale, during a single, say major climatic battle of course, of a regional campaign, right? And they cared very much about this. It tells you, of course, how important arrows were. Pack animals carrying spare arrows typically accompany armies on campaign, and likely also in battle. And at some point, these animals could be used in different ways, even to literally create some living barriers. We know that the Mongols, some cases, other people, like dismounted, for example, from there when they found them, in fact, in dire situations. They shot, like being from the, say, behind their mounts that were used literally as animal shields. And this is obviously depending on factors that can be everything right here, but having more or less arrows, like with you, having prepared, like just think about the cost for these people. So as we've seen, are not really swimming in wealth on a regular basis. Just knowing how to make arrows, like basically every warrior from the steppe knew how to just make one from, in the wilderness by themselves. But overall, like the organization of these armies, they were quite numerous, as we've seen, would have been really impressive. And there was a lot of organization after all, and the steppes are not really just a wasteland. There are some areas in which, of course, more wealth is more concentrated, there's more coordination, there are crafts, there is an administration, there is a tendency also towards sedentarization at some point, in spite of the essentials of the warfare remaining the ones we know. Everything leaves a trace, right? We've seen it, especially in the videos about the Khazars and how they, before being wiped out by the Rus, they were actually, in fact, going towards like a more sedentary lifestyle that, however, also corresponded to the softening up of their morals. And so ultimately, like, it's not that we're simply transitioning to a sedentary civilization could compete with the ones that had been sedentary, even if not particularly developed, like the same Eastern Slavs, but that still, as sedentaries, had an extra gear, right? So the scale, the substance, the essence of this civilization and cultural comparison is really crucial to picture in order also to understand how these armies fought. And as we've seen, they didn't have this radical advantages, if any advantage in general as a system towards like the sanitary ones. Contemporary accounts also indicate that training and practice were conducted. Of course, this would have taken place in a clanic context. The youth was trained in some of the most nightmarishly traumatic ways and selected literally as like killing them during the same process when failing. Talking archery skills, military tactics, this is not to say that they deliberately kill people. I mean, demographic resources, especially at this point in the early Middle Ages, are very important. and in the steppes they do matter. But say killing someone every once in a while just to test the others, to inform them about this whole thing is like something that everybody did in a tribal context. Right? These were also not really cultures provided with particular traces of human sensitivity. They skinned people alive. They ate them. That they used their corpses like just in as trophies. It's just like it's normal steppes life really. So it's also a completely different mindset from anything. It's you can barely describe what it was about. Also because we know too few in a strictly historical sense about that. It's already impossible, but at least we can at least get a glimpse of what, I don't know, in the sanitary world during this period a person could say live like and think like what their existence was about. Can you relate to someone from the steppes? It's incredibly difficult. It's ever more distant. Now, on the battlefield, the nomadic troops formed into small, scattered groups rather than a cohesive unit, right? Galloping across the enemy's front and around his flanks while raining down volleys of arrows. Technically, battle lines did exist, right? They tended to make like also a huge single battle line. It was the more preferable thing because, as we've seen, actually remaining compact was better. They, however, wouldn't have that level of collective training to actually remain. Like they didn't need it, right? As missile light troops, they didn't have properly the tactical purpose of remaining, say, aligned, right? It's something that the heavies must do. But their role was much better carried out also for what was good enough in the general, because, of course, trying to extend collective training is, like, where do you find the resources? I mean, this community leaves and fights like this because exactly they don't have the resources to do any better, right? And it was an enormous deal of competition between the various war bands that the clans produced. They wanted to be better than the others. It was all about showing off in the steppes, really. Everything was that changing as we've seen, and so Evo could offer a chance of a victory. Because he had already been, in fact, a conqueror and could display his wealth. Also, this is shown in arms and armor. That's why the elite was so elite, right, and considered in this way. Would be followed immediately, and alliances, groups like were sort of formed as dissolved so quickly, right, depending on these balances, making this oceans of horse archers floating all around, chaotic whirlwind of death and suffering. So there was a sense, of course, if anything, just because you attack someone frontally, you must have a front, right? But the obvious principle also in this was trying to outflank the enemy, which if you wanted to carry out, you must had to be done in a at least with sufficient numerical advantage, and this was difficult to attain. It was properly difficult to simply outflank the enemy because the enemy was so light as you, right? So yes, of course you can, as a unit, like appear from nowhere, like making a great turnaround. This was really done also in the sanitary world. When you look at outflanking maneuvers, sometimes we're talking about very extensive turns. I made a video about Mamluk tactics. There's somewhat in between, right? And these contexts, and we've seen that. And also the spaces, the distances, the coordination were something very complex and required a lot of planning, etc. And of course, if you are a horse archer that engages at hundreds of meters of distance, and you can also get the hell out of the way, and you can move, you can visually, like especially in the open steppe, realize or less where the enemy was, and the larger the formations they are, then the easier they are to see. Like, just think about the dust, so many other signals that they would have managed to grasp immediately. Like, you can't really quite achieve much of a surprise. You don't have this heavy punching, cutting spearhead either. So this was all about, like, wherever you needed to stiffen the line, like sending a warband here, and then it could come back, and doing this all incredibly irregular movement that was also left to the initiative of the single warbands, right? So it's really complicated and difficult to control. So, of course, charisma, like general leadership, and some sense of pre-planning, etc., was all important. No battle was identical to one another, even just in the tactics, about which we know too few after all, because of course what was happening in the steppes was not recorded, especially at this point, practically by anyone, for us at least to know, to have a write down to us. And so it was a bit of a mystery. That's why we always see this through the filter, the layer of the sanitary eyes. The nomadic horsemen sought out any weak point in the enemy's formation, like any other army, regardless of, say, the increased difficulties they had to actually find one in such a fluid formation like the one of their counterparts. This was different, for example, for the sanitary enemies that, however, were more difficult to break in the first place. And so the point was focusing the attention on this weaker part of the enemy line, or the formation, and the nomadic horsemen were prepared also, of course, to withdraw if no such weakness was apparent. They were skirmishing also from a strategic point of view, for the aforementioned reason. They didn't have great, for example, polyurcetic capacities of sort. This was notorious since ever. They were mostly about raiding and, devastating wide areas by scattering all these parties of horsemen around. And very often, just like the only glue that kept them together was the possibility of looting. So even politically, that there was no way to break through, like, an enemy resistance. Like, what was the point of remaining around in the first place? That's why I also stated the point of leaders was being very aggressive, very powerful, being exploiting as much as they could, but rarely succeeding in creating more, long-term success. And that's why they also sort of had this internal political upheavals and the creation, disgregation of confederacies, right? Of the killing, the rising of leaders, etc. When the nomads were faced with superior numbers, they could, by the way, rapidly disperse and reassemble with remarkable speed. And as we'll see now, even with a surprising order, which shouldn't be strange, given that, in the absence of natural obstacles, they would know very well where to go and how to orient themselves. Occasionally, they may have formed themselves into wedge-shaped masses, similar to the earlier tactics employed by the Siths and the Huns. This is interesting because of the, mostly necessity of making them move. Like, it wouldn't be much about the actual effectiveness of the wedge formation. Wedge formations were not really used in a strictly, tactical sense. I mean, for the purpose of combat specifically, right? Mostly this had to do with, especially in this case, with pathfinding, and or with the, which was pretty, in fact, appropriate for forces that didn't have much order themselves, or this was more likely in the sanitary context, like like the Wedge actually being an entire unit, an entire section of the line that would charge before the others. With the outer echelons following, and so having the shape of a wedge, but it doesn't make much of a sense actually to charge into an enemy formation with just a point of one guy. That even if it were the best, like, it would be taken out immediately, and so there wouldn't be order or something to exploit it compactly. So this wedge-shaped masses were mostly connected with the guy at the top leading the troops. At a certain point of the field, that this leader would have, the reason, right, to conduct his troops to, so that they would follow the lead of someone in the first place. It wouldn't just, because imagine like these scattered units that barely know each other, also like internally, and don't have much cohesion in the first place. Who does lead them, right? They are all sort of equal among each other, so you must have a guide, a leader to follow. Also for the battle maneuvers, especially the most important ones of the larger units on the battlefield. The feigned flight tactic was employed to lure enemy cavalry into pursuit, disrupting their formation and often drawing them into premeditated ambush. There was a decoy corps that turned back in the saddle. It rained arrows upon the enemy's front, the purpose being creating chaos and confusion. The feigned flight wouldn't always work either, because once these forces had exhausted their arrows, they would have made substantial damage, especially even against the sentries. Like, horses were quite the preferential target because they were largely unarmored, right? So the sense was, okay, let's spend these forces. It was difficult to countercharge them to an extent, at least. If they continued with this back and forth, like an irregular formation, you would have had some problems to especially spend some of the heavier troops even just to chase these guys. What for, right? But at that point, you also had not much of a better option than staying there and getting hit, and especially your horses suffering, which for also the enactment of a subsequent cavalry charge is not really the best, because you will have essentially the line as it was prepared for the sake of essentially frontal impact with being severely disordered. Some horses would be out of action, in some nights, so it's complicated, right? And then you would hopefully attract the enemy, like keeping, as we've seen also with the so-called Parthian shot, like never lowering the guard. And when this force ventured in, and they would be attacked from unexpected flanks and rear, caught off guard in that from that direction, and disoriented. This was the best way of operating. You could almost, I will not digress now, as I was already starting before, on the, let's say, frequency of these tactics. They would have been pretty much standard even in the sedentary world, right? The reason why the nomads enacted them more is, again, that they tended to give ground much more easily, and so their best chance was just to buy time and space as much as possible to exhaust the enemy and to stop him at the last line with the heavier, the heavier component, and just to exploit the flank from this with a concealed party. Sometimes even better forces, like the flank position, to hit the enemy asymmetric, right? There were also different lines of battle. This is evident also in the later Mongolian and Ottoman warfare that we get more information about. So it all depended on, right, the armies. Unfortunately, again, we don't know too much about the specific details at this time. But we can imagine, like, the more complex forces to have. The as we know, like, different lines, different groups. Sometimes sources tell us that literally these were coalition armies, and so a chieftain would go into battle, another wouldn't, or was waiting for this attack. And it's not maybe explicitated that they had been preset in that function, but you see, at that point it was mostly a political problem between them than the actual say knowledge of like whether this was a prearranged plan. We essentially learned that there were different blocks, like different corps, different forces deployed at a distance on the battlefield, and this is also pretty normal. And again, these armies could be pretty large. Like if you make a list of, or like it's true that the Senators tended to exaggerate, as we were saying before, but their size, but they tended to be that numerous because it's as if yes, basically they were mounted. There were lots of logistical implications, but these were also armies that knew exactly where to pasture, where to find, to forage. They counted on speed as well to get an advantage, but mostly they were light. So it's as if like the equivalent to the Sanitary War that had been just an army of I don't know, just 100 knights and then 10,000 peasants without armor of any sort, right? And so that sort of, I'm making it a bit like in proportions here, but there were of course different levels of armament depending on the people and their wealth, where they were settled, etc. I will partly address this now, because there's all a variety. Now we have to exemplify the single peoples that of course had sort of different traditions, influences, and so on. A touch of color. The Magyars' distinctive war cries included the haunting hui hui, apparently, right, as we're told. They would echo throughout the battlefields as they charged forward. Also, their noise-making instruments clashing loudly. The Magyars were a Finnic people of the forests, actually, just north of the steppes corridor that eventually entered the latter, and that also received along the way an enormous deal of Middle Eastern, more specifically Persian, influence that sort of continued later on, because one of the let's say minor branches of the Silk Road arrived into today's Romania, essentially, and there was a long lasting tie with some areas of the Caucasus, etc. And the Magyars came also with in fact an interestingly advanced polyrcetic capacity, so that they weren't, as I was saying before, just like there were differences between the steppes, because again I made a series probably about Eurasian steppes warfare. That's the title you find for each, and I describe every single people in their differences panoplistically, but also like the general history, etc. And the Magyars were slightly heavier than the average steppe. Well, not too much, right? Essentially they were, especially when they arrived, but then they had a history of sedentarization, of warfare with sedentaries, more, say, properly set into a permanently, like tendentially sedentary society. It would have not come back to the steppe once they had settled in Pannonia. And they were influenced also in the musical tradition by the Middle East, right? Something we've seen for mostly Islamic military music, but dating back to probably the nomadic peoples that used, in fact, that needed more advanced musical instrumentation at war, exactly to coordinate in the absence of some more, say, direct visual, probably even just direct military control, these forces through these noises. This was a way of communicating and a way to sort of even rally around, say, particular units, positions, etc. And the Magyars, as you know, were a ferocious people. We didn't talk so much about them, but we made multiple videos about them, the way of war. And with their enemies in disarray, they would engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat, so that they were more, they were heavier, as we were saying, and so they liked cold steel better. So seeking to rout their opponents with this ruthless efficiency, the Magyars seriously threatened to destabilize for good the eastern part of the Eastern Frankish kingdom. I mean, Saxony, Thuringia, Bavaria really suffered a lot from their raids, as you know, but they arrived as far as northern Spain, southern Italy, northeastern France, right? So they were pretty much everywhere during the 10th century. Made lots of videos about the second invasion. We will surely talk about the Magyars soon a bit more. When raiding, which was definitely their favorite activity, they would divide into small parties of around 100. In order to cover, of course, the largest territory as possible, also in the interest of time, just to be ruthlessly efficient in plunder, and so taking away as much as they could, evidently in the absence of an overwhelming enemy force that could simply chase them and hunt them down. Even if that was there, right? They would be quite like, how do you engage them if they are so fractured? Like you can simply march into the territory, and these guys would have to get the hell out of the way, but they would still recompact somewhere else. In fact, one Magyar tactic properly was, in fact, to have this more backwards position heavy component at even tens of kilometers, like a day of march distant from the line of contact with the enemy parties, right? So we're talking even 30 kilometers, and in this, they are in between, being ravaged by these lighter horsemen. So that basically, when the heavier armies, say, of the Frankish horde advanced just to try to intercept them, these raiding parties that function also as a reconnaissance, once like antennas, they would communicate like the enemy was closing in, and so even the heavier component had enough time to get the hell out of the way, and if they didn't really want to engage into like an open field confrontation. In fact, if suddenly confronted by a larger enemy force while split apart, the Magyars could seemingly reassemble quickly in some way. They, for example, would accomplish this through smoke signals. That was yet another way of communicating. Say, the enemy approach, you can easily communicate. You can easily communicate even across hundreds of, even thousands of kilometers in an incredibly quick way, just through small smoke, light signals of sort, flags. And it is reasonable also to assume that at least occasionally the heavy cavalry present in the nomadic armies, so as we've seen typically the chieftains and their immediate bodyguards, would have behaved similarly to what we get documented for the Yurkan, East Asian Tungusian speaking warriors. I made some videos about them in the early 12th century, and the later Mongols, who would charge at the enemy once it had been adequately disorganized and weakened by the horse archers. One interesting aspect about the concept of bodyguard, right, sometimes we find also translated by different in different languages, is the fact that, as we were saying before, albeit not always, the heavy cavalry component was, or the heavier, let's put it in this way, cavalry component would be proper of, again, a single tribe within the people, right, or the confederacy, so that that tribe specifically could count even tens of thousands, right? So not just a tiny elite, but compared to at least what you could mobilize in general, and of course you needed to move like on the heads of a much larger amount of troops if you wanted to mobilize that entire force. And so this had to be a very large army in the first place, would be literally, in fact, the ones who had taken all the surplus and had, in fact, heavier cavalry. And so when you read bodyguards and you read, I don't know, 10, 20,000 men, you realize that just a bodyguard, right? We're not just, I don't know, private contractors that had decided to serve this chieftain. I mean, in some ways it was, but this was a more cohesive group even. It was sort of an army within the army that would be employed, even if they weren't just there for showing off and no action, right? And it could signal like that's varying level of affluence among the various steppes peoples, and so who was what here. And of course we don't have to imagine like, I don't know, 20,000 heavily armored, nomadic cavalry. No, that wasn't the case, but just something heavier than the average, right? Some, I don't know, heavier, even organic armor, but so pieces of metal, right? The heterogeneity in their panoply was ingeniously different. In many ways, they used whatever they found. I made a video about the causes of the Mongol victories according to Western sources, and the latter were very interested in the Mongol armor that was, according to these descriptions, very patchy, like very irregular, very empirically built, made, and so also varying, and that was appreciated, especially for frontal blows. Then it had weak points and actually was not better than a Western one in general. But the Western one was also much more uniformly produced, right, in comparison to the steppe. And consider that these peoples tended to, in fact, purchase mostly Western armor, especially from the western side of Eurasia, but those are also the larger part of the steppe. But we've seen how far away, like it's ironic in a sense, because the steppe peoples are credited in ancient times to have developed mail armor, because if they had invented it themselves, like they sort of developed thanks to their metallurgical skills for their elite, and then it sort of passed more to the sanitaries in Europe, the Celts, but actually the chronology, actually the oldest one is Etruscan. The oldest find, at least we have, is Etruscan. This is not so much of a problem, who invented what, but when Western Europe sort of compacted relentlessly across the millennia, basically, like of course we began, as you know, with the Romans, the Celts, the Germans, to just produce this stuff like regularly for our military elites, and that was by far like the wealthiest place around from the just western part of the western side of the steppes. And the peoples living in the steppes were really importing the stuff like crazy. Right, we've seen it throughout also Eastern Europe, like also the sanitary parts, that the broader Frankish world at this point was exporting mail armor. If you look at Cazar armor, for example, you would expect it to be some strange lamellar, but we think that the average horseman had something like chainmail. Of course, they would produce also locally, right? That's not just a matter of imports, but let's say as a model, as a type of warfare, so tendentially what they would have had to be like, right? Heavier, and leaving a more seigneurial and affluent way, like the Western nobility, like they wanted to emulate them accordingly. There's another important feature of nomadic warfare that you're well aware of, and the Pechenegs seems to especially have enhanced the fundamental Turkic tactics by leveraging it through their mobile lager. So this is the various wagons, carts that nomadic peoples used on a regular basis, and that when ambushed out there in the steppe, they would use to protect themselves. Like this tactic was actually used by everyone, right? It's not really something that you need to mutuate from the steppes, and it was revolutionary. For example, I don't know, we often talk about the lager, the Wagenburg from the Hussite times, right? And I made multiple videos about Hussite tactics, and I'm very critical about the not the Hussite tactics, because the Hussite military successes were important in that context, and of course they're a bit overrated compared to the general state of the Western art of war. Was something actually more advanced than that sort of particular context in Central Europe. But as if this Wagenburg was this revolutionary tactic that allowed who knows what. Actually, the Wagenburg was sort of a desperate endeavor. It's just like, I don't know, the English having to dismount their men-at-arms during the 100 Years' War because they were so numerically inferior to the French. That's not a matter of doctrine, of having found the tactical solution to all your problems. It's actually something that you do only in pretty dire circumstances that, in fact, do not speak of a positive military situation. As we'll see now, also for these troops, you just use what you have at the moment to make the most of it, right, in a tactical sense. And in an intelligent way, they would succeed, at least in using this means. The lager comprised essentially horse-drawn or ox-drawn wagons. And it was used since ever, like the Scythians used this. There were lots of other peoples used it. This was actually present in the Western world. There were Wagenburgs in certain Western contexts that we tend not to stress so much. I mean, in places like Italy, for example, you don't think, like the Wagenburganism. Never hear of that. It was actually, like, it's documented earlier times compared to the Hussite ones. Also, like, it's normal that we would use wagons in certain situations just to create barriers. Like, what's strange about that? Really, I don't see the point. That's also not what wagons are mostly just designed for. So you would develop them in part to functionalize that tactical purpose. But as we were saying before, if you resort to that, it's not because you are in a normal situation, right? And so, like the Alans, the Turks, the Avars, the Khazars, so I say the Turks in general, of course, these are mostly Turkic peoples, the Bulgars, the Pechenegs, the Cumans, they would often accompany their campaigns with wagons, mirroring the earlier practices of even the Goths and the Huns, right? So again, nothing strange about the migration era. This thing existed also among the Germans. So what's really nothing strange about it? Nothing particularly ingenious about it. These are, let's stress it, very primitive people in general. So on arrival, they would form a defensive circle by tying the wagons together with ropes, creating a secure perimeter around their camps. There were all different means. There were some levels of mobile fortification, ditches. Like, these people were not completely, of course, unaware of some broader fortificatory capacities. Actually, like, they would sort of make the frog jump between some fortress and some camp and another, right? As you know, the nomads, this was true also in Europe, think about the Avars, they had massive ring forts, a bit like the Vikings did, right? When they stored their loot, these were not meant to be permanent, sedentary settlements in the way we intend, but they would sort of serve as logistical bases, because of course most of the surplus was stored there. This would allow for some broader long-range political coordination and administrative mean, right? So as we were saying, that there are some important regional, like, we're mostly talking peoples that are very, again, very unstable in general, and so also the actual longevity of these ring forts was pretty miserable, like, compared to the actual settlements of the sanitary world. But they would entrench, right? Also on campaign, they would know how to build this forts, and so you can imagine some broader stiffening of the defenses as well, that, as we've seen, were exploited. And this is often a missing piece in the art of war, the steppes, that actually makes up for what, according to you. We said it before, that the stopping power, right? If you manage to entrench in this place, it's just like, think about the Ottomans. I made a video about the Ottoman battle array. Where does the Sultan stand? With the Janissaries into an entrenched position, right, with ditches and palisades, and that's exactly the same thing, right, because that's where they would stop, right, in the absence of a strongly stopping infantry, the enemy at the last, right. That's also the function of the lager, not just a mere, okay, oh, the enemy is attacking us in 30 seconds, like ambushes in movies. Okay, partly would happen at a smaller level, of course. There's also something you could see in the Old West, right, in the Northern American plains. But just to give you an idea, it was the same identical thing. Inside the camp, felt or leather tents would be set up, and occasionally, in fact, a ditch would be dug around the outer perimeter to further reinforce their defense. It was nothing overwhelmingly articulated, also because these people had, as we've seen, like a very mobile way of doing so. Just from the sanitary proceedings, they would have varied about even the need of spending those resources for some better built camp. Some were, again, more articulated, and they weren't even so different from the ones of their neighbors to an extent, but they controlled different areas, they had different purpose, right? While it was common practice in the steppes to use wagons in warfare, the Pechenegs were the first to employ them as a better, at least documented and perhaps established tactic. In battle, their lager served as a safe haven for their cavalry to regroup, right? Which already tells you that, of course, it wasn't done like in a broadly like open field functional sense, right? If you need to regroup at least, and you don't have some troops defending this place, etc., it's not good news for cavalry in the first place. There were all kinds of engagements in which, of course, we would want to resist, like making troops enter. And if the lager was large enough, of course, like the advantage of the wagons especially is that you could at least mold partially the perimeter, enlarge it, or not, like with this extra fortification. But of course, the major engagements were out there in the open, right? There were, however, these oblique openings in the wagon circle, allowing the horsemen to charge in and out quickly. This could be, of course, relevant if there was an engagement just outside the wagon fort, and we're talking about smaller engagements in which, at least, however, the military force would have been, in fact, just smaller than. This is the point. Like, this camps can, in theory, contain the troops, but not to make them deploy effectively for battle. So the idea is that, for whichever reason you're fighting in the front of this camp, either you literally deployed the forces just outside in a functional way, and just to eventually retreat in this camp as the last hope of a broken army, they would be easily surrounded at that point. Or you plan literally like to this like using this essentially flanking force, like coming out of the camp, and this doesn't make it much easier than due to the problem that we listed than in open field, right? So there is no definite manual about how they did this, right? It would have been a clumsier thing than we made. There was, however, when we look at this more concretely, as dependently from the outpost or the being a fixed outpost or some mobile camp, enemies venturing too close to the fortifications, risking being lassoed or hooked from their saddle by grappling irons, wielded in this case by the Pecheneg women that would have at that point stayed within the camp, because these peoples moved with their families often. The broader expeditions in the Sanitary Wars were mostly carried out by the men, but of course there was always someone following them, also in the guise of field aid, etc. And very often these were the same families. And of course the women were to be protected within the fortifications, the circle. But there were also quite violent individuals themselves. I will not digress today either on the story of how were, say, steppes women really living in this much more militarized context and surely developing some more proclivity to direct violence, but for these cultures, like it was absolutely normal to be patriarchal, and of course women were not primarily involved in this. Of course, in a desperate situation, as we've seen in many cases, that they would find themselves fighting, but just out of human desperation, not because women were meant to fight in these cultures at all, right? And whenever you find them, say, matriarchal societies are very rare, right? And in general, like the last matriarchal societies in Europe date to the Bronze Age, right? What people meant by matriarchal sometimes in more recent times are just, I don't know, for some national cultural standards, and I don't know, a woman not being expected to have some, I don't know, management role in some land exploitation system, and that doesn't mean matriarchal, right? Europe is rigidly and fiercely patriarchal. It's always been, since for a very long time, since in the Indo-European invasion, and so it stayed. Now this women would defend the camp by dragging, as we've seen, like with lassos or irons, the enemies to either kill them or holding them for ransom. Lassos are important because at times you find the employment of these tools that were used, as you understand, for cattle, also raiding, but raising is primarily like that. These were all cattle breeders practically. That's what their wealth consisted in, also because that's the only one that they could more easily move and always exploit, and need also to feed and move in accordingly. Various pastures, horses, oxen, and even though these nomads would go at war normally with lassos just because they would need it just for their own horses, the spare horses that they carried with them. We'll talk about this in the army organization video better. They would use it at some they wouldn't use it actually as a main weapon, right? There are instances of, say, this people captured this other with lassos in this battle, right? And just they finished them like that. It's not that the lasso was used as an actual weapon in combat, or at least in a collective sense. Things worked with combined arms, and lassos had nothing to do with that. But in a situation when you had, for example, to chase the enemy, right, or even you had surrounded them, you had an overwhelming advantage of some sort, you could lasso them, you could tie them down, especially if they were heavier and less agile, and so these warriors could do it, right, even the women, as we've seen here. And this was a way of fighting as well. According to the Alexiad of Anna Komnena that we had the pleasure reading for the recent video I made about the Battle of the Eurasian, the Pechenegs, that as we've seen were quite nestily around in the time of her father's rule, were virtually guaranteed to lose if they fought without the support of their wagons, right? And this is a very interesting statement by Anna that, as we've seen, was quite intelligent in a military, tactical sense. She notices what I think, thanks also to her statement here, I'm ever more prone to believe was the case, that these wagon forts were, at the end of the day, normally going together with the army, because otherwise where would they actually leave them? Right? At some point they could, and they would. I mean, they couldn't simply run away with wagons that the armies, as we've seen, collapse, and that the enemies would take them. In fact, these peoples even used abandoned wagons as decoys in pre-planned ambushes. And so it could be a very clever ruse, right? But the idea is that, again, the wagon fort was to provide that stopping power that you could exploit then even to carry out successfully an ambush. In fact, by you stop this thing in the midst of a plain, there are some trees nearby, the enemy attacks you, and when he's engaged against the wagon fort, some ambush party comes out and attacks them from the rear. That's how you want to operate, right? Because you don't really have much infantry or stopping power to begin with, and especially at that point, if especially the best forces practically come from the heavier ones, that they are really in the rear of the entire array. Well, you will buy time with that. I mean, ideally the heavies would be deployed outside, because you needed that shocking capacity to be fully deployed in open ground, right? But if these had collapsed and your last line of defense was suitably the wagon fort, or you could even envisage to have some troops inside priorly arranged together with the ambush, well, why not? That can happen. There isn't anything strange about it, really. Naturally, the one notable disadvantage of the lager formation was its stationary nature, which allowed, of course, a more mobile enemy, especially in this context, to exploit this weakness by performing feint retreats himself directly away from their position. I would say luring, in fact, the enemies out of the camp with playing the same game, right? And you would think, but if anyone was using this tactic in this context, why would they knew that, right? As actually this was known, as we've seen, also by all those enemies that perfectly knew they were getting themselves into, they were also extraneous to this culture, because they didn't have the same type of tactics, but they would, of course, need to, if an enemy gives way, you have a chance, as we've seen, to attack him in a condition of superiority, because leaving a position doesn't make sense anyway. If you are superior, right, using just this force for decoying, of course not. You will stay there and keep paying to shoot the enemy from the distance, and only if the enemy thinks that he can break you and chase you down, he will do it, and then you will at that point have to rely on saying, yes, maybe there is an ambush party, the enemy would know that, but they wouldn't be sure until they try, right? And so it was a gamble that had to be based on whatever these forces knew about each other from so many other information and indicators. So obviously, everybody can use this tactics also in a sedentary context. Here it was just more frequent, but it didn't mean that, then what was the difference between as I always say, between a feint and a real flight? No, right? Because very often they're literally the same thing, even intentionally. So that's what where the coup d'oeil, where the skill, where the experience come, right, in leadership. And notably, there are no recorded instances of this tactic of the lager being employed, however. likely due to the fact that most surviving accounts of steppe conflicts come from outside observers who would have been unlikely to be present at a battle between rival groups of nomads. So yes, we are told that they used to do so, but we don't have, in other words, any battle documented about this kind of like interaction with the, like a more specific interaction of the troops with their lager. And this is absolutely normal for this time in history, but if you think about the relevance of these nomads at this point, like all the wars or the battles were fought, well, you understand how serious these tactics were, and as we'll see now, it's pretty much it. Like, we don't have much other essentials of this type of combat, and we have, of course, however, the evidence of course, camps were attacked during the battles. This was normal because it happened in every kind of warfare. There is always a camp, there is always somebody that at a point attacks it. Usually in the sanitary world, this nomads were used as well, probably with the purpose of raiding the enemy camp after they have exhausted their arrows. So defining themselves from the battle, because their usefulness basically had ceased to be, and at least they could have been awaiting in a disciplined fashion for the battle to be hopefully won to pursue the enemy. Instead, they would actually run to plunder his camp while the battle was still going on. That's what these people were mostly about. But as we've just seen, the deployment of the Wagenburg at the bottom of the array was just a stopping barrier, like the line, first and last line of defense against anyone who wanted to at that point to seize also the treasure. In fact, it was stored in the camp and everything. And we have actually a recorded instance of this scene in the Battle of Tal Afar in 1042. We have, however, a recorded instance of the Battle of Tal Afar, 1042, were in Mesopotamia, between the Oghuz Turks and the Arabs, where the latter actually are driven back to their own encampment by the Oghuz Turkic horsemen, that, however, found themselves at that point severely disadvantaged and unable to effectively use their bows in the confined spaces between tents and wagons. As a result, they suffered decisive defeat in the ensuing hand-to-hand combat. This sort of makes sense. It's not presumably much about the space for bows. It could be a thing, but here it sounds more like just that their formation was broken within the camp, so where they had entered, and you can't quite charge much in there, and so the Arab infantry would have at that point had much easier gain, and that's how things fundamentally went, and it shows you how, however, a similar outcome would have followed in a nomadic versus nomadic context. So it's not to say, of course, that every time these forces entered a camp on horseback, they would have been defeated per se, right? It's not true. That depends on what kind of force is inside. But this is a good example of at least what happened when at least a solid infantry of some sort, because I don't know here how, well put the Arabs really were after having been defeated. And in fact, you see what we're talking about. Like here, it's not that they would have chosen to fight in the camp if the battle had gone well, but the battle was outcome was reversed at that point, And the Turks would have chased the Arabs into the camp because they recognized that that would have been the only useful chance to actually defeat and now like a force that was essentially rallying within this fortification, and they needed for whichever strategical reason just to push on, and or I don't know, maybe it was a mistake, we don't know, but surely they knew much better than us about what was going on. And so again, an attack on a Wagenburg would have likely yielded similar results in general. Like all successful assaults on lagers recorded in contemporary sources were carried out by infantry, which was a capability that the nomads generally lacked, as we've seen. It's not even true that they didn't have foot troops. They would dismount, and in fact, attacking a fortification would have been the case in which this would have happened. The Oghuz Turks were apparently very good at that. I made a video about Oghuz tactics. If I'm not wrong, I have to re-upload it anyway. And we observed how these forces were skilled to target the enemy battlements that they would encounter also in the steppes, right? And so supporting the infantry, like storming these positions, which was normally risky because in order to approach a fortification, you would have had to generally didn't have the same advantage on those were compared to those who were on the battlements, and especially cavalry was very targetable with suffering losses. So what fascinates you about these steppes peoples is how the Oghuz were very powerful. First of all, they also sort of predate the sort of progenitors of the Seljuks, even though the Seljuks actually contributed to terminate the the same Oghuz. But how, let's say, tough like the steppes peoples were, how pressed they were to the point of maximizing their efforts, even with, as we've seen, meager means at their disposal, to the point of actually outperforming in certain tactics. Of course, not just the most typically equestrian ones, of the steppes, the cemeteries, right? And so they had their means, as we've seen, to cope with fortified placements as well. Even though, generally speaking, again, they lacked most of the polyurcetic skills to carry out something more sophisticated than these essentially just sort of direct attacks, trying to see if the formation would have broken just by the garrison resistance would have broken just by pressure, because sometimes, of course, actually we didn't even need to fight to capture a fortification. If you had, I don't know, there were 800 Oghuz Turks attacking a 30-man garrison fortress, like, of course, the latter would have enjoyed some advantage, but not to the point of lasting too long in the first place. By the way, the nomadic tactics, as we've seen in some videos, particularly in a recent one about the Turks, like the nomadic auxiliaries in Eurasian service, would have an influence on the sanitary neighbors in many ways that we will see better also in other videos regarding especially the defensive armament of all this crescent, this stretches fundamentally, at least in Europe, but there were interesting developments, in fact, pretty much everywhere at the frontier, with the step from the Balkans to essentially Eastern Europe, including larger shields, flatter ones, properly create some screens, right, to defend from this continuous hail of arrows, and however also counter-offensive capacities, such as mostly archery, that was also, like, from the sanitary side, very intense. Like, generally speaking, also with crossbows, etc. Like the Westerners had sort of a upper hand on the nomads, right? After all, if archery was all that, it wasn't all as we've seen, and so if that, however, was one of the best things the enemy could carry out, like say the senators were not inferior to that in volume of fire just per se. The Ruthenians, for example, adopted the concept of wagon fortification from the Pechenegs and the Cumans by the 12th or the 13th century at the latest. Or better, we should point out again that anybody would have used them also way before, just it's documented at this point. The Ruthenians had, as we've seen in various videos, including the one about the Kievan Principality, some avant-posts, especially in proximity of the mouths of the great Ruthenian riverways flowing to the Black Sea, that were essentially in today's southern Ukraine, that has this in the hinterland a steppe corridor that is not it is actually inhabited also by the Slavs at this point, but it's mostly nomadic. The Karakul pack, the Black Hats, so-called, are located, participating to the Ruthenian civil wars, etc. Because at the end of the day, it was useless just to control the steppe. It was practically nothing. There were the wild plains, in fact, but of course the river ports, like the ones that connected also with the major cities in Ruthenia, were of course so very important to maintain, and therefore the same Ruthenians would have found themselves in the condition of having been there in the open, having their own wagons, carts, etc., and having to protect themselves from Turkic ambushes of that kind, right? And they would be able to attack the enemy in similar ways with their auxiliaries, but also with, like, Ruthenian knights had horse archery going on, even though they purchased Western panoplies. They mostly fought towards that direction, but they were sort of more individually versed, right? That's normally the elite, even the elite splits, like with the shock, between the shock element and between the shock element and missile, one of the lesser followers. But in this pretty intense frontier that also remains, the Ruthenians called the wagon fortification the Gulaigorod, which translates to walking fortress. Gorod, as you know, is the fortress. It's also a toponym of so many places in Eastern Europe. And Gulai stands for that kind of mobile dimension. So that's how they literally would see it. But this is being used, it's used still today with pickups, etc. They do it, like in the desert especially, in the open plains, flat plains. The host sites, as we know, would further refine this technique in the 15th century, and they surely drew inspiration from the Pecheneg wagons, but also from practice that would have been actually present even among the same Hungarians that they were fighting. And yes, it seems to have spread eventually from those years from the Hussites rather, but we know that in that frontier with the Ottomans and the Golden Horde, these things, as you've seen, the Ruthenians had it, so it wasn't like, I don't know, they didn't have context, they didn't know about these tactics, the Hussites reinvented it. No, they just essentially maximized it to some extent, and then there were some, or at least declined it to their own specific tactical needs, and then some of these were to be met also in part by, say, the Hungarians fighting against the Turks, right? And so we find that, and it's a non-linear process really, but it's also about general principles, tactically speaking. So there is nothing really strange about finding this tactic among practically all, any people, if you want. The Cazar Kagan commanded his army from a wagon situated at the center of the battlefield. again, very similarly to what later the Ottomans would do with their entrenched position, sultanate position. So in part this served as a mobile command post, but of course it would be mostly stationary, right? It is true that still, like in that case, like some Mongol commanders had, like of course the major tent of the Kagan was mobile, right? This was true from quite an early era among the nomads, right? And so it would move, but generally speaking, when we look at the wagon as a whole, and so also its tactical employment, it's important to have seen, as we have seen, also to have ditched it, to have further fortified it in some way, right? It has to be immobile, right, when you are defending from it. By the 10th century, it seems that the Khazars wouldn't make any further consistent use of wagons to fortify their camps. It's a bit difficult to actually measure the truth of this statement, but since the Khazars had been slightly sedentarizing and they had also been building more permanent fortresses, some of which were very impressive, telling the truth, also in the steppes, and the Ruthenians basically raised this progress because they overwhelmed, as we've seen. They got the upper hand. They began to raise the Khazars. We also don't see much further this period. According to the 10th century Persian poet Marvazi, the Khazars were very close to Persia in many ways. Like they had similar context to, as we've seen, an influence like from Persia, right? Like the Magyars. Each Khazar horseman carried 20 short stakes, which they used to erect a palisade around their campsite each night. This is interesting from a logistical point of view, just like the Romans that would carry themselves the Pila Muralia, that were like pretty large pieces of fortification that allowed them to, like increasing dramatically, by the way, the burden they had to carry with them. So it's very interesting here for a Persian source to actually point similar like commitment by nomadic forces that you wouldn't expect to be, in fact, that invested in fortification, stable camps, like particularly developed structures, and instead, right, the Khazars were advanced in many ways. They really had a lot of influence from the same Persia, from the same Eastern Europe, so they from the Byzantines. So they were civilized to an important extent to find this. Of course, you wouldn't have to think about a massive fortification everywhere, a Khazar army stop, but there is this tendency of, again, stopping a bit with movement and concentrating a bit more with entrenchment. Sort of makes sense, right? Consider, okay, I want to draw a parallelism with the settlements founded in the Baltic during the Viking era, most of which didn't have a future. They were abandoned as long as the Viking era and consequently slave trade stopped. So that, in the steppes we would have something similar. So we don't have overwhelming archaeological evidence of this stuff, but it sort of makes sense anyway from the sources. Marvazi goes on, by the way. It says that the Khazars would lean their shields against this palisade for added protection. So this is also interesting. Think about the shields on the Viking ships as well. We are in the same year, so we're Vikings fighting against the Khazars as well. Marvazi notes that such a palisade could be constructed in less than an hour as well. So it wasn't apparently even just a particularly developed thing, but it still would do, and the Khazars were known at least for this practice. The Khazars also prefer to employ their subject levies in the forefront of battles, deterring desertion by implementing a stern regulation that essentially mandated the execution of any soldier who fled, as well as the crucifixion or hanging of their commanding officers. These are interesting measures. What is fascinating here about this nomadic populations is that, as you know, especially when they came into contact with sedentary ones that sort of gave way to them, they would essentially start shepherding them and using them as auxiliary forces. This is very well known during the migration era. And so the reference here, the Khazars evidently having, at this point they exercised this control on the Ruthenians in part, at least before the tides turned. There was the Slavs were actually receiving mostly this nomadic shepherding throughout these centuries, and used as infantry, notably, so as forces that could be spent also against fortifications, so making up for that lack of say infantry component. And of course the idea was that the chivalric warrior from the steppe as a knight would rule over these conquered peoples and using them as auxiliaries in that supporting function. There is an interesting mention by Fredegar's Frankish chronicler under the year 623 concerning the Avars having a similar as peculiar custom, that is, when on campaign they would often remain in their camp fully armed while their Slav subjects did the fighting. This seems unlikely. Like, we may not believe Fredegar completely, meaning that Avars had, by the way, were ranked by the Byzantines as the single most advanced barbarians in terms of art of war, military capabilities, and much of their capacity laid in their cavalry, and so in its mobility, in its shock effect, combined arms tactics. I think I actually made a video. I searched it a moment because I already made a video reading the Strategicon about them, and I mixed it together with the Bulgars, with the Magyars as well, because we're talking essentially about the same thing. Oh yes, it is Avars and Magyars from the Strategicon and Leo VI's Tactica. So if you want to check that video out, there you have properly the Byzantine voice on the topic. All right, and then I did more about these peoples. You can easily search that on Schwerpunkt. But just for saying that, again, as I said at the beginning of the video today, we don't read directly from there, but use these other sources that plenty of. But that's sort of more comprehensive explanation with sort of best info of the period, because notoriously the Strategicon for these eastern populations, it's sort of the most obvious. And so, as I was saying, it's unlikely that simply in a battle, normally the Avars would simply send the enemy out. The auxiliaries out against the enemy without their own support and just remaining inside the camp fully armed. They would have already deployed. They would have already prepared themselves to intervene. It would have been close. Here, what it seems that Fredegar's Chronicles is referring to is that practice we have already seen to send detachments ahead. Here, the fact that before we were talking about same nomadic horsemen, right? Here we're talking about Slavic infantry, because they mostly had not just but mostly infantry, and as such they would even more need like cavalry support. And in fact, Fredegar's Chronicle goes on and says, if the Slavs emerged victorious, the Avars would then proceed to pillage. However, if they found themselves hard-pressed, the Avars would provide backup support for their Slav warriors. So yes, the pillage makes sense, the support makes sense, it's just the context that, again, this guy is remaining in the camp waiting for the Slavs to do what exactly? Against another host? Like, unless, yes, you can maybe send Slavs against Slavs, as the Avars would do. But, it's obvious that everything is better if you coalesce forces and, operating combined arms with this, by the way, edge of cavalry that the same Avars had used to subjugate this last troops. So it doesn't make too much sense. Of course, it's a way to spare our force, but without that combination, like you would have to spend more Avar force anyway, because you're not giving that edge to your own forces. So this is either an extra confident sort of behavior that Fredegar wants to attribute the Avars to say how sort of powerful they were, that could simply send this throwaway Slavs ahead, or it's just like probably in fact a misunderstanding or of some sort. But there is always some reason in origin. Let's talk a bit about the Bulgars as well, that we made some video on. Being that peculiar relation with the Byzantines, waging often a defensive war against them, but also offending them, pillaging the Balkans, the Aegean valleys, etc. And having also, as you know, in their ranks a strong Slavic component. Initially they were exactly like that. They were essentially Turks, right? Some of them were Indo-Europeans as well in this step, like it's not the Indo-Europeans had been wiped out when the Turks arrived, but the Bulgars were mostly Turkic. And they, however, were absorbed by the majority of the Slavic population. There were some Slavic princes who were relatively autonomous, but overall they had fallen under the Bulgars. And this infantry capacity, together with the nightmarish Balkan hinterland, would allow the Bulgars to, so here, because in these centuries there is the passage also literally in this blending between from the Bulgars to the Bulgarians, right? So that's the thing. But the idea is that they would operate from the mountains, engaging battle stereotypically, at least only when they could ambush or trap their enemy in a valley or pass, right? So combine this skirmishing tactics, but also with a bit more of infantry, because cavalry doesn't operate too well into valleys. And we've seen like this being very typical of Balkan warfare. And the Byzantines, of course, just in order to try to ambush the Byzantines, it means that the Byzantines were the strongest, otherwise the Bulgars would have come to in the open to fight. But as you know, some of the most atrocious Byzantine defeats during this period were scored by the Bulgarians, thanks to this kind of tactic, right? The Bulgars would often construct palisades at either end of the terrain to funnel the Byzantine forces into a kill zone, and of course you can't exploit fortification if you don't at least dismount. So we're talking definitely of a different context from the open steppes. Bulgaria is not steppes, right? And if the Bulgars managed to capture a Byzantine fortress, they would at least tend to dismantle its defenses, massacre or enslave the population, and then quickly withdraw. At least this is what they would do when they, of course, were trying to establish like a deeper frontier, so a greater distance between them and Constantinople, to prevent the Byzantines to, say, have a more advanced basis of operations. Otherwise they would occupy the same place. But they knew, of course, that they were disadvantaged at poliorcetics compared to the Byzantines, so this is the trend, but of course it's an approximation, depends on the context. The Bulgars are not really documented explicitly, like in the tactical Leo the Wise, Leo the Sixth, that, as I said, basically just continues. I mean, he literally rewrites the Strategicon and adds just some extra note about some updates. However, he categorizes the Bulgars alongside the Magyars as, quote, birds of a feather, implying that both employed standard Turkic tactics. And this, the Byzantines used the term Turk for speaking of all these nomadic peoples that were not the previous, like, Scythians of back in the day. So of course their ethnography was advanced, but they didn't distinguish too much. Like they had a pretty classicistic sort of categorism. while the Bulgars obviously did employ the bow, they seem to have made relatively limited use of it compared to other nomadic peoples, and this is just a perspective illusion for the same reasons we illustrated. Yes, the Bulgars of the steppes made the same identical use of the bow to any other nomadic people. Just when they settled down in the Balkans, they would essentially become more sedentary, and they would thus stop making that at least the same use of the bow that they just to the same extent that they used to do before. Also because now finally they have better means than that. And it is true that Bulgaria, and we will see this better in other videos, would keep maintaining a great deal of horse archery. This was true since like in the region since ever. Like the Thracians that inhabited Bulgaria back in the day, the ones from the north, from the Danubian side, were using horse archers, because you see there you have the Danube Valley, that is the channel from which like steppes peoples descend, and you have later on the Cumans, as you know, settling part there. You have this continues, like, and also the Mongols will pass through there just cursorily. The Bulgars are always exposed to this kind of steppe influence, and they will maintain it. But again, we will make more specific videos about every single one of these units in depth, so I'm just looking forward to it. I just am angry with the magic cycle for not providing us with more early medieval warfare stuff, but what doesn't come out before will come later. Don't worry, just count of me to be alive by then, and everything is fine. And so, as we've seen, although Turkic armies primarily utilize cavalry as nomads, right here, the Turks are prevalent. They're not the only people out there. I made a video about the islands that were at least in part. They had, say, at least mixed with other peoples over time, but they were still Indo-Europeans, right? They would provide bodyguards with everyone: the Byzantines, the Mongols, the Chinese, but dominantly, like, the Turks were controlling the steppes, right? And until the Mongols, right? But this exceeds also our timeline, and so they did employ infantry as well to some extent. They used, as we've seen at least in Europe, mostly Slav auxiliary troops, because the Slavs were practically like extending this across the entire frontier. Many ways they had sort of repopulated it, in part, as they were being shepherded by the same nomadic peoples that had come to sort of oppress them. The Pechenegs and the Cumans, however, had their own infantry forces, and so any actual nomadic people would have some of them. I should digress also in here. We talked about it in some videos about, so not specifically one dedicated just to it, but in the various videos about steppes warfare, we address this fact that some parts of the steppes are sedentary, right? Even in as atypical and sometimes properly non-documented islands out there in the steppes that we're not knowledgeable of. And this is not just about like the Cumans, for example, the Tarim Basin. We're talking like literal islands of what are still technically semi-nomadic peoples, but that achieved some degree of local stability and began to settle down to some degree. Some were like even fairly advanced. Like we talked also about the Volga Bulgars, for example, that found some stability, etc. Right? So you have this variety. The Khazars were prepared to dismount, engage on foot when necessary, like also all these other peoples, but we are told specifically about them. That's how history works. It's mostly about documentation. The use of these infantry units remains, let's say, unclear. Like in the case of the Khazars, it's obvious that being more settled down, more influenced, also by interacting with more sedentary peoples, they would have the need of using these units in similar ways. Of course, it's likely that they would have primarily consisted of archers, javelin throwers, but we shouldn't rule out that there would be even actually tough infantries, because if you have, it's just like in the West, like if you have, what's the difference between a heavy cavalryman, a heavy infantryman? They're the same person sometimes. Look at the Normans, right? Mounting was infantry in that sense, different from cavalry. The same goes for the Cazar and any other nomadic or semi-nomadic elite that simply could dismount and fight on foot, as we've seen also in the Wagon, and so on. And of course, there was a level of cohesion of training. Like the fact that these were nomads doesn't mean that prevents you culturally from absorbing how to fight on foot. Like it's pretty universal. Like the reason why they fought mostly on horseback was, again, the broader political social balance. But if you have to dismount, you will fight on foot, and that follows similar principles after all. There was a lot of foot combat, telling the truth. Many of these infantrymen may have been stationed within the Wagenburgs during battles, which sort of makes sense to fall back on into it in case things went badly, but also serving as a shield to cavalry, right? The defensive force, this cavalry, as we've seen, had corridors to withdraw inside the Wagenburg, like the same would have existed within the infantry, all right? Never been really a fan of the idea that there were corridors in which cavalry retreated. This would mostly happen for the skirmishers, for troops that were at least spent, because of course if you want to go into battle successfully, you have to be deployed, arrayed, lined up, and so, like, especially for the heavies, this was a bit a necessity. You couldn't simply jump around. You would have been exhausted by the weight of your own panoply. You would have just lost order, cohesion. That is basically what the shock force that you're designed for, like, this can't be used like in those situations. In the Byzantine sources, an observation is made that is likely applicable to this nomadic hordes in general, not just those serving, by the way, in the Byzantine army as, say, tributaries / mercenaries / even subjects / soldiers, properly, like like sometimes they were the same Byzantine soldiers, like, and that's especially towards the later period that the situation had become like. And this was that the efforts on the battlefield tended to be more focused on plundering the enemy's camp than on defending their opponents. And again, this is fair, because again, compared to the heavier troops, they tended to do this. As we've seen, they were just more habituated to disperse and to carry out that operation, as the camps were normally empty during the battle. And if we were to break the enemy, was like the problem solved about the camp. Generally speaking, if you were defeated, everything was lost anyway. It was resisting in the camp wasn't like much of a solution. We've seen before the battle between the Oghuz and the Arabs, but let's say that's not what normally happens when an entire army melts away. The Byzantines had pretty large forces, including these ones, this lighter guys, that were really, again, sometimes in the tens of the thousand. So really prominent forces that, however, were dead unreliable. They were actually also very cheap, right? So you would have this heavy Byzantine force that was a bit, exploiting the nomadic auxiliaries in the same ways we've seen a Magyar army would do, and with the lighter elements anyway, like screening, like maintaining this distance with a ferocious enemy that could be that insidious, including the same nomadic ones that tended, as we've seen, to attack by surprise, with speed, with this tendency to at least risk a lot catching the enemy off guard, because it was at some point the only way you could actually obtain anything in that regard. And so there is a lot regarding the interaction. We will see it in some videos. We talked about the Battle of Bulgar, if you're interested, by the way. There are recorded instances where nomadic auxiliaries tasked with operating behind the enemy lines became distracted by the opportunity to loot baggage or camp. These are like the norm. Think about the Balkans getting heavily re-influenced by nomadic warfare towards the later Middle Ages because of the Mongols, the Ottomans. Think about the Stratiots at Fort Novo, right? And this fact that they were expected to outflank the French, and instead they began to loot the baggage camp, or say their camp. And so the point is that we're just looters, right? Nomadic peoples were, as we've seen, obsessed with wealth. They wouldn't see any, and they would want to put their hands on it, because for the place where they lived, it was so disproportionately a bigger deal that they could make a living out of away from the miserable one. It would still be incredibly miserable, but still, with that much wealth, they could have changed substantially their own lives. And so they would disperse without concern for the outcome of the battle, especially if they were burdened by the loot, right? Leaving their employers stranded and vulnerable, especially if as we've seen, like they especially abandon them in the midst of sort of the most crucial circumstances, and leaving them exposed, in fact, to also similar enemies of that kind. It was like a very risky lifestyle in business, because, as you understand, it's all based on gamble. That's all they do. They don't have much of a chance to withstand a prolonged fighting. They wouldn't see themselves staying for too long. We've seen it also in the videos about modern warfare. The Tatars, for example, that the Ottomans use more or less with the same relation. Really don't understand why they have to stay after they have plundered. Like, they want to remain for the final battle. Like, their point was just, laying waste everything and coming back to Crimea. This is what normally happens in this war, that, as you understand here, across the ages, really remains more or less the same. This is what I think is very fascinating and also tragic, dramatic, like a culture that doesn't practically not evolve, at least compared to sedentary standards, and remaining more or less based on the same principles, not evolving more than much. But especially in this period, especially if you look at the beginning of it, the migration era, etc., like they were really, working hard. Like they were the ones taking over the steppes. They were the ones establishing this power. So we're ephemeral in many ways, unstable as we've seen, but it was their moment, right? And especially considering the collapse of civilization had just occurred. There was, we shouldn't overly exaggerate, but it was a severe exhaustion, shrinking. They were living in hell themselves. I mean, things were not going well for the nomadic world, compared to the sedentary one. Everybody suffered the same crisis. It was terrifying. But at this point, at the beginning of the period, there is really a closer gap between the two. Like, you have also a greater degree of hybrid. You see these peoples that manage to settle after all in Europe, at least the eastern part. Some of you have the Huns, the Avars, and the Bulgars, the Magyars. Like, this wouldn't happen but in the early Middle Ages, so that because of the obvious vacuum that, especially in that Balkan, Central European area, had produced itself. And it's like it's all something you can explain historically, politically. I made lots of videos about these peoples because they're very important and somehow underrated. I mean, whenever I make videos about these peoples, it's strange. Everybody clicks on them. I think it's because of the ethnicistic reasons. I make much better, much more interesting, actually even much more. I admit it actually took some taste for this steppes warfare, like the way I explained them tactically, etc. But it's become easy and maybe even more entertaining. But I make much better stuff, and people don't watch it for some reason, and this is relatively frustrating. But I know that. I don't know, this is how YouTube works, and my point is to cover everything as much as I can in detail, let's go on. That's what we do. We shouldn't be afraid. And there's so much to do still, so going step by step here is the best thing for today. However, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.